Hi, everyone. We're just waiting for folks to log in, and we'll get started in just a moment here. So thank you for your patience, and we'll look forward to getting started. I'll just give everyone about another moment to log in, and then we'll get started. Hopefully everyone can hear me. If you want to just type in the chat box that you can hear, that will help us make sure that everyone who's in the participant panel can hear us. So it looks like we have about 30 people who've logged in, so I'm going to go ahead and get started. Welcome, everyone. I'm Alexis Bucknam. I'm the Executive Director of Utah Campus Compact here in sunny Salt Lake City, where you can see that I'm incredibly backlit, so I apologize for that. We're excited to have Randy Stoecker here for our webinar today. Before I introduce him, I wanted to take a moment to familiarize you with the Zoom platform if you've never used it before. So I see many of you have typed into the chat box, so I appreciate that. We'll continue to use that, as well as the Q&A, which is also in that bottom panel. If you click onto that, you can type in any questions. I'll be monitoring that, and when it's appropriate, I will go ahead and ask Randy to respond to questions if they relate directly to what he's talking about, and if not, we'll save questions until the end. We plan to spend about an hour or so on the call today, the video conference. So we'll look forward to hearing from you that way. Just so you know, you are all muted, and so the only way you can communicate with us is through the chat or the Q&A. And that's just a way that we're able to keep the ambient noise down and have as much time to deliver content and get to the subject at hand. So I'm really excited to introduce Randy Stoecker. Hopefully all of you have purchased his Liberating Service Learning book. I know I have. Randy is actually a scholar out of the University of Wisconsin and has done a lot of work that I really admire around really advocating for community voice in the community engagement work that higher education has undertaken, and has written some books about that in addition to the critical service learning book that he will be sharing some of his insights about with us today. He's also been out to Utah for one of our community engagement institutes. So he did a great job working with many of our faculty to really think through how to more effectively work with community partners. So with that, I'm going to mute and turn off my video so we can focus on Randy. And he's going to go ahead and get started, and he's obviously can share anything else about himself that he'd like to, that might help us with our conversation today. So with that, Randy, I turn it over to you.
Thanks, Alexis. And hi, everybody who are virtually here and who are presently here and who are future here. The internet is a very non-linear medium, isn't it? What I want to spend a little time today doing is talking through my thinking in the latest book, the Liberating Service Learning book, which by and large, it was me trying to work out my own angst, my own concerns, my own worries about the practices of higher education that I engage in and that the rest of you engage in as well. And what we'll be doing today is focusing on just one image. And it's not super exciting to look at, but it'll give you a sense of my thinking, and I'll kind of walk through it box by box, and then we'll have some time to talk about it. So hopefully everybody can see it. And what I want to do is, first of all, talk to you about the big graphic and in the big picture of the graphic. So you'll notice that there are three columns. One of them is called Institutionalized Service Learning. The next one is called Partial Fixes. And the next one is called Liberating Service Learning. You'll notice that the first two columns have straight arrows from the boxes. But when you move from the second to the third column, the arrows invert and the boxes invert. And that's important to me because in how I've been thinking about my own practice over the years and practice in general over the years, what I think I've been realizing is that the problems that we've had, we've kind of tried to fix, but there are some more fundamental problems that have caused me to literally stand the entire model on its head, and that is the third column. Now, let me talk through a little bit what I think we've been doing and what I think we've tried to do, and then we'll go on to talk about the alternative that I'm trying to practice now. So the way that I've been thinking about this is that when we think about service learning, when we think about any kind of higher education that engages students, the focus has historically been on student learning, first foremost as the greatest priority. And then we talk about those students engaging in some kind of service as a secondary priority. And then we kind of give some lip service to this thing called community as a third and fairly distant priority. And then fourth and the most distant as a priority is change. And so learning first, service second, community third, change fourth, and at the very bottom. And let me talk a little bit about learning. So in most of the service learning stuff, and it's interesting how many service learning offices are also experiential learning offices and how often that idea is combined. And this whole idea of experiential learning, if we look at the actual literature on experiential learning is this really sophisticated method. And as a method, what it means is that a teacher actually sets up an experience, and the experience is designed and set up specifically for students to learn a specific concept or concepts. And if we look at most of the service learning, the distance between what we're trying to teach and the kind of experience that we're giving students makes it really hard to connect the two. For example, think about kind of, your average soup kitchen, other kind of charity service kind of activity. The idea is that we get students somehow to learn something about poverty. But when we put them in the role of a charity provider, what students are actually learning is they are learning how to be a charity provider. They're not having an experience of poverty. Right? And so the experiential learning model doesn't even fit with what we're doing. Now, the other thing that comes into play here, and how many of you remember and know how often John Dewey is cited as kind of the hero historically for service learning. And it's actually very interesting that Dewey actually didn't do service learning. He separated out, in fact, his educational models from his political engagement models. And the educational models were focused on children, not on adults. But more importantly, Dewey is one of the people who is cited for American pragmatist philosophy. And so Dewey and Dewey's colleagues are engaged in this idea of pragmatism. And pragmatism is kind of the anti-theory theory. The idea being that you just go out and try stuff. You keep what works, you get rid of what doesn't work, really roughly. There's a lot more to it than that. But that becomes really different than from really theoretically informed kinds of social engagement. And that's also perhaps why so much of the service learning is focused on just going out and trying stuff rather than engaging in really sophisticated change strategies. If we go down to the service box, the next thing to start to think about is how we think about service. The service that we typically think about is charity forms of service. They are forms of service from people who have things and give those things to other people, whether that is soup, whether it's housing, whether it is tutoring, that so much of it treats the recipient as somebody who is needy, who needs to be given something. And then students are treated as people who have something to give, which sets up this interesting power imbalance. The other thing that in this kind of classical institutionalized service learning model that we have emphasized time and time again, in fact, you could even pay thousands and thousands of dollars now for software to track it, is this idea of hours, that the important thing here is to put in hours. Doesn't mean how much impact we get. What it means is that we get credit for putting in the time. And the hours model, we did some research. If anybody out there who is familiar with the Unheard Voices book, when we
Andy, are you there? We lost you for a second. You might need to go back a few sentences.
Oh, okay. Where did you last catch me?
You were like kind of riffing off the hours, I think.
Oh, okay. Then you really only lost me for just a second.
Okay.
And yeah, we'll hope for the best. With the internet is not only is it non-linear, it's also like really unreliable. So this idea of putting in hours is one where we track hours, we don't track outcomes. And when we talk to organizations about this, what's interesting is that a student who puts in 20 hours, so they meet what is kind of the typical requirement, the organization that they are putting in those hours with is probably providing 12 to 16 hours of training and supervision for that student. And so the net take for that organization may be 4 to 8 hours out of that 20 hours. The third piece of this is that so much of the service we do is coming from an assimilationist model. So for example, all those tutoring programs, all those after-school programs are about helping the children in those schools adjust to the school rather than about organizing the children and their parents to get the school to adjust to them. We go to the community box next. what is this idea of community? We use that word like we all know what we're talking about, and I'm not sure that any of us do. First of all, it becomes this all-encompassing thing. We talk about working with the community. We talk about serving the community. But when we are in the field, we're working with real people who may or may not have relationships even with each other, let alone with us. And we may actually not be doing anything that is at all engaged with community. The other thing that we talk about trying to do is become part of the community in our service learning. And yet our engagement forms are exchange-based. So for example, what we say is, well, we will exchange charity service for those people, and in exchange, we want learning for our students. That's more like going to the grocery store and buying a gallon of milk than it is engaged in a community form of relationship. The other thing is that we start with this assumption that there even is such a thing as a community that we're working with. I mean, so many of the places that I am engaged with, there is actually not a community at all. The relationships have been torn asunder. People don't trust each other. People don't share with each other. If we're really talking about a community and we're talking about working with the people who've been the most marginalized, the most oppressed, the most exploited, the most excluded, then we're actually not talking about community. Finally, when we get to change, we actually don't talk much about change. We don't talk about measuring starting points and ending points, or if we do, we talk about measuring the starting point and the ending point of a student in a class who's getting tutored. The challenge with that is that if we are looking at change as a one person at a time thing, we may actually be doing more harm than good. Because if you think about what happens in neighborhoods, in places that are being disrupted by all kinds of forces outside of the people's control, if you help some individuals in the community, quote unquote, the people you are most likely to be helping are the people who have the most to start with in those places. And as you help them, they then develop the skills and resources to be able to leave that place, leaving the place itself worse off, because now there are fewer people with the talents and the skills and the resources than there were before, because our model is an individualist model rather than a collectivist model, which again contradicts the idea of community in the box above. This also then becomes rooted in what as sociologists talk about as a functionalist theory of change, which is a theory of change that actually fears change. So any change that happens too suddenly, too much, too drastic is actually seen as a problem. And so the idea here is that we have to change as gradually and slowly as possible, which pushes us back to that individualist focus. Now, for a bunch of us, and this has been going on for 20 years now, for me, we worry about all this. This doesn't feel right. We don't like the outcomes that we don't see. We don't like the effects that it has. And then a few years ago, when we did the research that led to the Unheard Voices book and heard the community organization stories, I became even more concerned. That book was the kind of the research that left me worried. And then it is about, okay, so what do we do about this? Well, what we've seen over kind of the last decade are some attempts to fix some of the problems that are identified in the institutionalized service learning model. So now we're in the middle column, and starting in the learning box, one of the things we did was we created this thing called CBR, community-based research. In public health, they call it community-based participatory research. It's called like 35 other things too. But the idea here is that we engage students now in doing research, and supposedly research that matters. Well, interestingly enough, we haven't developed our models in such a way that at least people in quote unquote community spaces notice our community-based research. I had a PhD student a few years ago did her dissertation talking with the people in the lower Ninth Ward of New Orleans about all that service learning and all that higher ed community education that came down there in the wake of Hurricane Katrina. In fact, my student had been going down there for years and years as well after that, and had built real relationships. One of the interesting things that people there said was that, you know, while they actually weren't so impressed with the service learning that students were doing, because they were gutting houses, and when they gutted houses, they didn't just take out the drywall, they also took out all the oak woodwork and ruined it. So that wasn't so great. But they actually appreciated that students were there caring and listening and hearing their stories. Whereas the researchers, even those people trying to practice community-based research, were actually just seen as exploitive researchers. And they weren't seen as people trying to work with the community or engage with the community. They were just seen as data collectors again. So we haven't done a very good job with that. When we go down to the service box, you know, we're now talking about reciprocity and mutual benefit. And, you know, this is really interesting stuff because, you know, I mean, first of all, at least for me, you know, I'm employed by a multi-billion-dollar higher education institution. And I'm working in many cases with organizations that have little to no budget whatsoever, or at most, they have a $100,000 budget, but that's actually even pretty rare. And what does reciprocity mean between a no budget organization and a multi-billion-dollar university? Is that really what we should be thinking about here? Is reciprocity? Does reciprocity actually maintain inequality? The other thing we've tried to do is we've tried to do this thing called project-based service learning. So rather than the hours model where you just put in 20 hours or 25 hours, what we are talking about in the project model is that you actually have a deliverable. So something that you are doing as a group that you hand over at the end. And I mean, this is certainly improvement. The challenge is, as we'll get further down in the boxes, that so many of those projects are not actually connected to change at all. And so we end up doing research, or we end up gathering things that will sit on the organization's shelf just the way many of our journal articles sit on our academic shelf. Then we'll go down to the community box. We've tried to spend some time thinking about, well, what is community? So one of the ways we've talked about it is this idea of social capital, that we need to build up communities' social capital, and we need to build up their assets, and we need to build up their sense of obligation. But what we're not doing in any of those models is looking at or thinking about what is disrupting community, what's getting in the way of building social capital. What is preventing people's assets from being put to use, and what prevents people and stops people from having mutual obligation. And so these are all ideas about the kind of community we want to have, but not about any theories of what's preventing it, which could, if we had those theories, show us a little bit about the kinds of service we might be doing that are different. And then finally, change. You know, we still can't get our heads wrapped around this idea of change. When you look at the research that's being done out there, what we're basically doing is asking organization staff how much they like us. We're not asking them what's really being accomplished. And so we have all these satisfaction surveys that tell us that organizations basically like us, but don't tell us how much we've accomplished. And then the rest of our evaluation work is output focused. And those of you who've kind of run around in evaluation land, understand the difference between outputs and outcomes. And outputs are how many students you have putting in how many hours with how many groups, and outcomes are what changed because of that. It's only that first part, how many people putting in how many hours with how many groups, that we are really carefully studying. So I'm left really dissatisfied by my practice. I'm left dissatisfied by the practice I see out there for the most part. So I start thinking, how can this be different? How can this be better? And I start thinking about the couple of successful experiences that I have had, really successful experiences I've had, and how those got organized and what they were focused on. And what I began to realize is that, in fact, the most successful forms of higher education community engagement I have had have started with a really intense focus on change. And one way to think about change is this idea of the sociological imagination. And you don't have to be a sociologist to think about the sociological imagination. The idea of the sociological imagination is that in contemporary society, we can distinguish between what are called personal troubles and public issues. A personal trouble is something that you think only you have, that your experience is unique and you feel alone with your suffering. You also think that there must be something wrong with you, that somehow the cause must be inside of you. So you feel alone and you feel like it's your fault. If you move from that personal trouble perspective to a public issue perspective, what happens is you start to realize that your experience is common with many other people's experience. And you begin to realize that the cause comes from the system that has been created rather than from your own fault. And so the idea of change is that we start to work with people in the real world to get them to move from a personal troubles perspective to a public issues perspective. And that involves working with two types of change. The first type of change is that we get people involved in working on real issues. Now, that may just be getting the potholes in their street fixed, or it may be creating a new park, or it may be trying to get a different kind of policing. But it starts with an issue, and it's an issue as defined by the people experiencing that issue. And then the second form of change is for those people to get more powerful collectively. And so that as they organize around the specific issue, they also begin to develop power so that they can have more collective control over their own existence, whether that's because they can influence what government does, whether that's because they can influence what corporations do, whether that's because they can influence what colleges and universities do. That's the second type of social change. And in contrast to, if you remember way back to the bottom corner over here, where I talked briefly about the functionalist theory, up here, sociologists talk about a conflict theory of change, that people who already have an excess of power, who already have an excess of wealth, are not going to like this. And that we need to understand that, and we need to work with that. And that the conflict is going to be inevitable. That doesn't mean war. That doesn't mean people necessarily shooting at each other or throwing bricks through windows. Now, it can actually be very peaceful conflict, but we have to understand that our interests are in conflict. And that, in fact, when it comes to power, it is a zero-sum game. And so I start with change, and I start with thinking about change that way, and then I look for projects that engage that. But I also, and in the second box, I start to look for projects that focus on not a community, but a constituency. And a constituency is simply a group of people who have a common experience. They can be people who all live in the same crappy rental building. They can be people who live on the same street that needs its potholes filled. They can be kids and parents of the same school that isn't meeting their needs. They can be any group of people who have something in common that they can organize around. And they may not even be in relationship with each other. And part of the process then is to bring them into relationship with each other. And then if you remember again, back over here in the institutionalized service learning community box, we talked about our kind of definitions of community being exchange-based. Well, in this model, they are what's called use value focused. And so instead of thinking about how I exchange something with some group of people so that I'm exchanging research or hours from students for learning for the students, instead we become focused on creating something in common that helps us all together. So we engage in working for the cause, whether that cause is to change the school and improve education, whether that cause is to get the potholes filled, but we're all focused on that cause. That is a use value for the community. So it is changing something that the community will be able to put into use for itself. And so then the other thing that we're engaged in here is thinking about community as an outcome goal rather than as a starting point. We're very, very rarely actually starting with a community. We're starting with some kind of constituency, but our goal is for that constituency and ourselves to develop a sense of community through the process that has stronger relationships than it did when it started. So our form of service then becomes very different. We're no longer engaged in handing out stuff, in giving stuff. We're no longer engaged in an inequality of relationship where some people are givers and other people are getters. Those of you who hang out with activists and have been working with this idea of allyship, some people are now moving to solidarity, and I think I actually like the idea of solidarity better. But the idea here is that those of us who are outside of the issues that people are experiencing engage with the people who are experiencing those issues in ways that build the people's power rather than maintaining our own power. And then this, to me, leads me to classical forms of community organizing practice. And anybody who remembers the name Saul Alinsky, Saul Alinsky is one of my heroes. Ella Baker is another one of my heroes. The idea here is that you bring constituencies together to engage in those two forms of social change, to build organization, to build power, so that we can literally transform the structure of power. And then the third piece of this, and this third piece is in there because I'm talking from the perspective of somebody who's in a higher education institution, is this idea of knowledge mobilization. Now, in higher education, we're not actually any good at community organizing, except in some very rare cases. And so the community organization is something that really needs to come probably from someone outside of the institution. But what we can contribute is the knowledge mobilization, because as people organize around issues, they discover things that they need to know. They discover things that they need to learn. And our role can be in helping people to know those things, helping them to learn those things, whether it is learning how many potholes are in the street, what the process is for getting those potholes are, and who the person is that you have to go to demand that the city fill the potholes, or whether it is understanding how the school is not serving students who do not come from a mainstream white middle-class experience, and then understanding what kinds of education would better serve those students. So then finally, the learning box. The learning box is no longer about student learning. It's about everybody learning. And in fact, it can even be about the professor learning. I'm currently working with a project that is working with a network of hip hop artists. Oh my goodness, I can't tell you how much I'm learning in that project, and it's wonderful. But the idea of learning here is what's called popular education. Anybody who might have ever heard of the Highlander Folk School in Miles Horton, or have heard of Paulo Freire, you have heard about popular education. The idea of popular education is people learning themselves and engaged in a participatory learning process rather than simply being given information and given knowledge. So when we work with groups now, this is no longer a knowledge transfer operation. It's not like, I as a researcher go away and then I come back and say, here's your knowledge. Instead, it is about working with the group so that we're all learning collectively and we're all bringing our different forms of expertise to that learning. The learning is also constituency centered. It's about the people with the issue learning. And with any luck, myself and the students know much of what we need to know to actually engage in the technical pieces of allyship with that group. And it may actually be then that the constituency teaches us about their experience. And then most of what we're doing in the knowledge mobilization is a kind of participatory action research. And that isn't necessarily the case that, when I'm using participatory action research here, that it's different from the community-based research here. I just use the word differently because it, for me at least, emphasizes a little more the importance of the participation, and participation not being token participation, but real control over the research, and that the research needs to be connected to action. We need to do research in such a way that it mobilizes knowledge and can actually then be used directly and explicitly and consciously by a group working for social change. So that now is what I try to do. So when I work with a project, I am looking at a change project. And I'll just briefly walk you through the project that we're currently doing with the Hip Hop Network. So this is a group called the Urban Community Arts Network in Madison. One of the things they have seen, Madison is a nice, liberal, progressive place, except when it comes to race. We have serious shortcomings when it comes to racial equity here in Madison. One of the manifestations of that lack of equity is in entertainment. Local hip hop artists have very few spaces where they can perform. They were pretty much shut out of the network of bars in the city. And the Urban Community Arts Network, or UCAN, has been working on this, trying to help hip hop artists get access to performance spaces in bars. You know, and I mean, this is not just a small thing to do for entertainment equity. This is also about economic development in Madison and who gets economic benefits and who gets cultural benefits from the arts. So one of the things that is out there, and we keep getting reminded of this by news stories, is that hip hop music is perceived as attracting danger and attracting violence. And so the bars are scared of it. Well, as we talked with UCAN, we talked about a bunch of different possible things that they might do, but the thing they settled on was to do a study to see whether or not the few hip hop performances that have occurred in Madison have been more violent in terms of police calls. And we were able to get a police data set of all of the calls to all of the bars in Madison with entertainment licenses for the past 8 years. And then I had a capstone class of students who then added to that data set all of the performances and the genre of the performance for each of those police calls. Oh my goodness, the students spent just literally hundreds of hours looking up data and going and talking to bar owners and looking at the newspapers and the weekly. And I mean, they really busted their butts on this project. Put this data set together. We analyzed it. Interestingly enough, this was a capstone class that started last fall. We then began to get a sense of how big the project was. And I had 6 of those students continue with me this spring through independent studies to put together a really good data set. We just finished analyzing it, and we in fact discovered what we suspected, which is that hip hop doesn't attract more violence, at least according to the police calls, than many other forms of music, including rock and roll, including country, including karaoke, of all things. And now, through this process, UCAN has convinced the mayor to sign on in support of establishing an entertainment equity task force in the city of Madison, which was one of the things they wanted, and that's now going through city council, and with any luck, that will be approved. And this research will come directly to that task force as they think about ways that they can encourage and support hip hop artists in Madison. And so, you know, we started with this issue of change. As we are engaging with the constituency, they are doing things that are bringing hip hop artists together, including the annual hip hop awards, which many of the members of our class were at. And so we weren't just doing a research project, we were also trying to connect with people outside of that research project. The students are very, very committed to racial equity in Madison, as am I. And, you know, so our allyship has been very much about engaging in a cause we all collectively care about. And we are all learning just incredible amounts about how to deal with this data and how to interpret the results we're getting, and then how to educate people about this because the local media is interested in it as well. Right, so I'll stop there. And then you can have a chance to talk back, and I'll see if I can respond to anything that's coming up.
So you can use the Q&A feature at the bottom of the panel if you'd like to ask questions. Oh, one thing that did come up while you were speaking, Randy, that I wanted to make sure I didn't forget was we had one person, Caitlin, who mentioned she's heard the word accomplice in
Yes.
terms of thinking about allyship lately, and that was one that stuck out to her as one that people responded well to.
Yes, yes. Thank you, Caitlin. Yeah, accomplice has been a kind of third recent one that has come up as well. Yeah, I mean, I don't have strong feelings about one or the other. Solidarity works well for me because it has been a concept used in social change. Accomplice is one of those words that I felt like we have to reclaim from the criminal justice system, and so it's a little harder for me.
Yeah, I can understand that. Questions for Randy? You can use the chat box too, whatever works for folks if you're having a hard time with the Q&A. I wanted to just comment, I think one of the things that really stood out to me in having heard this presentation a couple times is the constituency focused piece. I was just at a community engagement summit here in Ogden, Utah, and they've sort of picked a particular neighborhood. And so now I think the next phase is really looking at what constituencies exist in their place-based neighborhood that they're working with and really trying to tease that out. So I think that's pretty exciting. So the first question we have is from Elizabeth. She says, from where did the hip hop project idea emerge?
Well, this is an interesting little mini story that the president of UCAN is also, her day job is working with an organization called Nehemiah in Madison. And Nehemiah is a Black-led community development organization in the city, working on a variety of racial equity issues, and has created a kind of sub-project called Justified Anger that comes from the Reverend Alex G., who African-American minister in town, is part of the leadership of Nehemiah, and who does all these talks around town on racial equity, and had somebody come up to a white person come up to him after one of those talks and said, you know, it's so nice that you're not one of those angry Black men. And he said, well, actually, in fact, I am angry. And he said, you know, and anger is justified here. And so they create this project called Justified Anger. And I had a previous capstone class that worked with Justified Anger, and then worked most closely with Karen. And, you know, in that project did not work as well as I wanted it to, for a variety of reasons. But my relationship with Karen developed through that project. And then she said, well, you know, Randy, we got this group called UCAN, and we could really use something like this. And so we actually spent from about January, well, really January to August, doing the pre-planning on this project before we started it in September. And so it came from Karen and UCAN, but through this previous relationship.
Great. We have a couple more questions. So let me, okay, so I think these are somewhat related. So I'm going to kind of synthesize them. And if we don't get where you want to go, Lucy and Elizabeth, let me know. So one of them is saying, you know, this is a big concept where would you suggest we start? And then a similar, I think, follow-up question is related to the constraints of the academic year and how you infuse a liberatory approach within those constraints. So kind of how do you get started, and then given that we do have within institutions of higher education constraints, make sure that you're infusing that liberatory approach given those frameworks.
Yeah, thank you. Because that I think is something we really need to start spending some time on. As academics, we need retraining. And I mean, interestingly enough, I am having the privilege of doing 2 trainings, one next week, one in June, at 2 universities that will be focused on helping faculty understand community development and community organizing models, and then how to connect community engagement to those models. Because that's just something that we don't know, we don't teach, we don't learn, we don't understand in higher education. And so we literally need retraining in order to do this kind of stuff. And the retraining is in fact possible. It's just that we need to commit ourselves to it. And you know, the academic year thing, I have found that to become less and less of a barrier all the time. And I think there are 2 things that help it make less of a barrier. One is that I never have the projects be student projects. They are always my project. I am the person, me the professor, working with the organization. And then the students are part of the team that I lead. And so I work with the organization well before a class. I work with it often well after a class. We had one project with an organization a couple of years ago doing a kind of historical recovery of the organization's history. Started off, you know, again, a few months of pre-planning, then the course, and then I had students extend into a subsequent semester so that we could make the project bigger. And then I kept working on it afterwards, and then they actually used it for a big set of public events that I was a presenter at. So, you know, a project that was supposed to be 1 semester became like 3 years. And, you know, that's something else that we need to think about as well, that this is not for students and it's not about students. If this is about change, and then it's about me as a professor being committed to carrying it on. Now, it doesn't necessarily have to be me as a professor. It can also be somebody from a service learning shop at the college or university who keeps the thing going over time. And that is about then getting service learning shops to rethink how they do their work, so that these are people who are engaged in managing projects, not in this hours tracking craziness that we have gotten ourselves involved in. And you know, when we start doing things like that, the semester doesn't really matter anymore. Now, the other thing that's important is being able to not have this be an add-on and to have this be a real focus. So I, for example, have the privilege of teaching the capstone class in our major. The cool thing about a capstone class is it doesn't have any content. So you can put whatever content you want to in it. And so when I do one of these projects, we do it with a capstone class, and the entire class is devoted to the project.
We have a couple more. One is from Tandon. Can you talk about how you see critical service learning being different from liberating service learning? So maybe teasing out some of those distinctions between the 2.
You know, the way that, and thanks, because I realized I missed that as I was cruising through the boxes. So thanks for reminding me that the critical service learning thing interestingly enough, is an application of, mostly an application of Paulo Freire to student learning. So what's interesting is that in critical service learning, the idea is actually still experiential, but instead you're getting students to think critically about what they are learning from the experience. Now, the problem is, of course, that now it's still focused on students. It's not focused on change, and it's not focused on the constituency work. And what's interesting is that a lot of that critical service learning actually becomes critical of the organizations that the students are working with, rather than systemically critical. And it comes with the same problem as the other experiential models, because for Freire's critical service learning model and the experiential model, you need a specific designed experience to develop the critical thinking from. And so in an amorphous, kind of disconnected experience doesn't work. And so again, if the idea is to become critical of systems of power, but you have students dishing out soup in a soup kitchen, there's this disconnect between the experience and the critical thinking.
That's actually a great segue to Seth Pollock's question, which is, what insights do you have to helping higher ed institutions appreciate the reprioritization that is embedded in the liberating column, emphasizing change and community and deprioritizing the learning box?
Yeah, I keep struggling with this question of, what do we do with the institutions themselves? Institutions are designed to be part of the problem. They are hierarchical, they are led by elites, they are huge power brokers almost any place they exist. And, and I'm not convinced that the institutional self-interest isn't actually doing, quote unquote, liberating service learning. Rather, I think the strategy is a more subversive kind of strategy, that this is for people in the margins of the institution to engage in. And hopefully, as they engage in it and build some sense of confidence in how to do it, build some models of how to do it, publish some stuff on how to do it, they begin to see a kind of trickle out ripple effect into the institution. But yeah, the last thing I would want is any institution to suddenly say, we're going to do liberating service learning and impose it, because of course that contradicts the whole model to begin with, and it would corrupt it from the very beginning.
Great. We have one more question, which I think is perfect timing for wrapping up. Before I read that question to you, I just wanted to recommend something that Catherine put in the chat box, if not everyone saw that, which is something that Breakaway does called Accomplices Not Allies, Abolishing the Ally Industrial Complex. So that's really designed for students and practitioners. So if folks are interested in that, we would recommend checking out Breakaway, one of Utah Campus Compact's partners. So we have two questions. Well, we have two more questions. I think we can probably cover these in a few minutes here, so we'll address them both. I'll read them both to you. Most faculty are deeply tied to their discipline. How do we center faculty learning and involvement as an investment in this approach? And then the other one is, could you speak a bit to why you're calling it liberating service learning versus liberatory service learning? So I think that's a good way for us to end the webinar. So there you go.
All right, Cool. The second one's easier than the first one. Um, but yeah, what do we do with faculty? In a lot of places, the question that people start with is, how do we get more faculty to do this? I'm not sure we should be talking about getting more faculty to do this. I think we should be talking about better, not more. And even if it's just a couple people, that's fine. We can worry about more once we have protected and moved toward better. And there are increasing numbers of faculty who are looking for something different. There are actually increasing numbers of faculty who are coming from interdisciplinary, multidisciplinary, even transdisciplinary kinds of approaches and perspectives. And there are still kind of old school discipline, people who are kind of stuck in disciplinary thinking, but those are not the people I would recruit anyway. So I think, again, let's work with the folks in the margins rather than trying to put this in the center, because as soon as you put it in the center, it's corrupted. And the reason I called it liberating service learning rather than liberatory was, I suppose, one, I didn't think of liberatory, but two, I like the double entendre of liberating service learning. So first of all, this is a service learning that can liberate people. And second of all, this is a model that will liberate service learning from itself, at least for me. And so liberating service learning is freeing service learning as well as service learning that frees others.
Great. I think that ends our time this afternoon. So I want to just personally thank Randy for spending some time with us this afternoon.
Thanks, everybody.
Yeah, to see you talk about this at the National Campus Compact Conference. And so I'm glad we were able to bring this to a larger audience through the webinar series. So with that, I'm going to turn off recording and wish everyone well. And just so you know, we will be posting this to the Campus Compact of Mountain West website. So you can find it there if you want to share it with other members of your team. And we'll also be sending out the visual. I know some people asked for that, so we'll send this visual, which obviously gives credit to Randy on it, so that everyone can have that to look at. And if, like I said, if you have not purchased his book, I recommend it. So we'll look forward to hopefully seeing many of you at a Campus Compact event in the near future. Thank you.